Well, a very happy new year to you and a very special word of welcome to everybody at our campuses. So glad to be with you guys in Kernersville, everybody in Clemens, and all the saints in King, as well as everybody joining us online. Are you ready for some good news? In this troublesome world, there's one thing that need not be troubled: your heart. Jesus offers you His own peace, the calm of His very heart. Well, I hope you've gotten off to a good start to your year. I hope you had a good New Year's Day. I did not watch football on New Year's Day. Instead, what really I delighted in most, I immersed myself all morning into the early afternoon into the New Year's blessing. Can't wait for that next Sunday, all our campuses. And so that was wonderful. Time of the Word. It's a pretty day. We were out of town, and I just declared it was pretty enough. I was going to go to one of the local golf courses and try to walk 9 holes before it got dark. So got out there late afternoon, and nobody out there at all. They said, sure, you can go walk 9 and to your heart's content. So I go out and walk holes and have the golf course to myself. And I played better than I thought I would. I got to hole number 9, finished up, and I thought it'd be pitch dark by then. It's about 5:15. Well, it was still just a bright day. There was a little bit of ambient light. And I said, you know what I really want to do? Practice a few chip shots here on the 9th green. Nobody on the golf course. Put a dozen golf balls down, hitting some 15-yard little chip shots to practice. This is where your score comes in, the short game. And so it was nearly perfect day. What a way to start the new year in the Word of God with so much hope for the new year. And then one of my favorite things, just to be in nature and take a nice walk and hit some good golf shots. And I'm chipping some golf balls, and suddenly I hear somebody yelling. And I thought, oh no. I said, I hope I haven't done the dreaded, most rude thing imaginable, and that is linger on this golf green while there's somebody behind me waiting to play up to this green. Because that's very rude if you ever do that. Like if somebody's behind you, move on so they can play. And I turned around, nobody out there. Of course there wasn't. It's dark. Everybody's gone home. And I heard this voice yelling, and I realized it wasn't somebody on the golf course. Some man 250 yards away had come out of his house, and he was yelling at me, yelling, "What are you doing?" I'm like, what? I'm hitting some chip shots. What are you doing out there? You look like you got a bucket of balls you're hitting. Go to the driving range. I'm like, what? I'm like, what? And he's like, you're ruining the green. Well, you don't play golf, you can be aware of this, but golf balls, when they hit a green, when they come in from a distance and they come in high, they make a divot, they make a little ball mark, and you're supposed to repair those ball marks. But this is a firm green. I'm chipping from about 15 yards away, and none of them are making a single dent or divot on the green. I love golf, and I take care of golf courses. I usually walk. I hardly leave a footprint. I don't want anybody to ever mess up. It bothers me when people have driven carts where they shouldn't and they leave track marks. I hate all that. And I'm like, I am the person who takes care of golf courses, and I'm getting yelled at. And at this time, a number of options went through my mind, as they do. One was to go down and have a peaceable conversation with this man and explain to him that I too care about golf courses. I was damaging the green, not at all, and have a peaceful conversation. I wasn't sure if it would go that way. And then I also considered the possibility of running down there and telling the man to get a life and kicking him in the shin. That went through my mind, just being honest. But instead, I gathered up the golf balls, put them in my golf bag, even though I wanted to chip another 5 or 6 shots, slinked over to my car and drove away. Yeah, normally you think you get more than one day into the new year before somebody's yelled at you. What's wrong with this world, you know? And I'm driving away, and I've had a nearly perfect day. Time in the Word, time on the golf course, beautiful day, thinking about all the positive possibilities of a new year, and yet something now felt unsettled. My mind said, Alan, you didn't do anything wrong. You're just out there in the near dark, hitting a few chip shots. You take care of golf courses. Don't give it another thought. My mind says that. But something inside me just felt a little different than it did just 20 minutes before that. I went from this kind of serene state to just being a little unsettled. I was picking up supper at the restaurant. I called Ann. I said, "What is it that we're picking up?" And first thing I said, "I just got yelled at on the golf course." She's like, "What?" And I had to tell her, I had the story, I had to process it a little bit. And I laugh about this story, but I also say, isn't this kind of what happens to us? Like you find these moments of serenity and happiness and joy, and then how often there's some obtrusive voice, either from the outside or your own mind, that invades right into that place of happiness and contentment with some kind of shame or accusation. I mean, this man, he's just some old codger came out of his house. He's a quarter mile away. He's yelling at me, never met me, and I really felt like he hated me. I mean, that wouldn't sound like in his voice. And now there's something inside of me that's like, I feel a little unsettled. What is that? It is a troubledness in heart, where your mind knows everything's okay, but something in you feels now a little more angsty, and it's hard to even pinpoint that. I think that's what happens, is that there are invasive thoughts and voices that are doing war against the kind of peace that Jesus really wants us to have. He makes us this incredible offer. I like the New Century Version that tells us the words of Jesus, "I leave you peace. My peace I give you. I do not give it to you as the world does. So don't let your hearts be troubled or afraid." He's sharing his longing for his disciples and for us in that intimate discourse in John chapter 14. I was at a theological roundtable in October, and at lunch break, participants around a table I was eating at then started talking about what is sometimes called an epidemic of anxiety in today's culture in America. And one of the participants was relating about a recent book from Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation, which I'll reference in a moment. And in this discussion about anxiety and how much of an increase there is in our culture, I just had a vision, an image that just came up, and just like I would call it, came up in my spirit and touched my mind, and I saw it, of laying a gentle hand on 1,000 shoulders and saying the words of Jesus, "Don't be afraid." And in coming days and weeks, I became convinced, I think by the Holy Spirit, that this was the substance for the New Year's blessing from John 14, and that this is the basis of a whole sermon series which we begin today. And with it, I feel convinced the Lord has brought some precious and powerful promises that we will all be encouraged and strengthened, and that we will have many in our midst who will find that it's strong enough to call even a breakthrough, and for some, it's going to be a cure of maybe an anxiety problem or disorder. I think all of that is what God has in mind. This is so relevant, this whole discussion of anxiety. Jonathan Haidt is a secular social psychologist who teaches at NYU, and he's written this book called The Anxious Generation. He begins that book with this word picture, saying, imagine you had a 10-year-old daughter, and she was being recruited to be part of the first human settlement on Mars. And you didn't know it, but she wants to go. But then you found out that they hadn't really thought through what it would be like for a girl to go through her growing adolescent years in a planet that had such low gravity, how that might affect the muscular and skeletal systems in her body as she grows, what it might do to the cardiovascular system, that it could permanently change the way that she is physically, or how the lack of a screen of protection around it at Mars, like we have on Earth, would allow more radiation in, and how it might impact. You start realizing they have no idea the permanent changes that this will make in rewiring my child. And of course you'd say, don't go, I'm not going to let you go. But Haidt says in this word picture, he says, that's what's happened. He said, that's what's happened to this generation, but they didn't move to Mars. Instead, they became part of a digital planet. And he points to two converging technological advances that happened in the years 2009 and 10. Two things. The iPhone developed a forward-facing camera, the selfie camera, and the social media platforms developed their algorithms for likes. So at the same time you could take a picture of yourself and post it, there now was an instant feedback process where you could find out if people liked it or not. And he points to these two converging technological advances and says that people, especially the young girls who went through adolescence during this period of time, have been rewired. And what's resulted is that we have what many people are calling an epidemic. I thought about giving you a lot of statistics, but I'm going to give you just one. A 2023 study of American college students found that 37% of students said they felt anxious always or most of the time, and 31% felt anxious about half the time. Now, I'm just going to pause here and say this 2023 study showed that amongst college students, less than a third of them reported that they felt anxious less than half of the time. Another way to put this, nearly 70% of all college students say they feel anxious at least half the time, and a third of them said almost all the time. The rate of self-harm for adolescents has nearly tripled from 2010 to 2020. I know this level of anxiety is not the issue for every person, but here's why it's so relevant. We all feel, sort of like I felt driving away from that golf course, a little angsty in this atmosphere we're living in, that we're breathing in, that has so much negativity. We all have that. So we all need to learn about the calm of Christ. But even if anxiety is not your struggle, one thing's for sure, somebody close to you is struggling. And so it's an issue for all of us. It's also relevant to us, not just because it's widespread, but anxiety is just one of those things that's so destructive. Irma Bombeck said that worry is like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but never gets you anywhere. Well, not only does anxiety not take you somewhere, it takes you backwards. Increasingly, we're learning that anxiety is harmful to our physical being, what it does to our cardiovascular system, what anxiety does to our sleep that then is related, they're seeing now, to dementia, and on it goes. And anxiety hurts relationships. When we're weary and we're worried, we're at our worst, aren't we? So it's really important that we get at this. And also, I would say part of the relevance of this is it just feels so bad. That angsty, anxious feeling, it just feels so bad. It's emotionally painful. Humor helps, and I was looking at some online tweets, people that were trying to relate what their anxiety feels like in some comical ways. Here's the way one person put it. It's like the brain says, "Hey, what you doing?" And me, I say, "Nothing, just relaxing." And then the brain says, "Would you like to think about all your failures?" Me, I go, "What? No." And the brain goes, "Okay," and away we go. You know, that kind of inner dialogue that's going on? Or one person put it this way. Anxiety says, "They hate you." Me, I say, "Who hates me?" And anxiety says, "They." That's the other part about it. It's so general, so much of this, and we're going to talk a lot about this. It's like even identifying what is that I'm feeling. I think a lot of us are feeling anxious. We don't even know that's what that is that we're feeling. Or, I got a kick out of this. One person tweeted, they said, "Great news. I found the cure for my anxiety. All I need is for everyone I know to tell me definitively that they aren't mad at me once every 15 seconds forever. It's just a bad feeling, isn't it? This is also relevant mainly because of this. God cares immensely about the peace in your heart. He just cares. Someone has suggested there are 365 exhortations in the Bible to fear not. I don't know if that's 100% accurate, but fear not, for I'm with you. Fear not, for I'm with you, the Lord says over and over in the Old Testament. Paul says in Philippians 4, verse 6, do not be anxious about anything. Jesus just lived this life of calm, putting on display. We'll be looking at some of the scenes of his life, but he just lived this way. And then in this intimate discourse with the disciples, he says, I want you to have this that I have, this deep inward calm. It's an amazing promise. I leave you peace. Peace, biblically, is much more and much better than merely the absence of conflict. Shalom, the Old Testament Hebrew word for peace, the greeting which people in Israel would have for one another, shalom, shalom, is to refer to a more holistic well-being. There's an interesting moment in King David's life where he's asking about the progress of a military campaign, and he asks, how is the shalom of the war? I heard the preacher of my youth mention that many, many years ago, and I never forgot it, and I preached on that some years ago. How's the peace of the war? Which is saying that peace is not just the absence of conflict. It is something different and deeper and bigger than that. The biblical notion of peace is not superficial. It's not about denial. In fact, God at one point speaks through the prophet Jeremiah to critique those that are offering a superficial version of peace. Jeremiah 6:14, they've healed the wound of my people lightly, saying, peace, peace, where there is no peace. The peace of the Bible is not about glossing over something. It's not about being superficial about it. What is it? What is anxiety? Well, the diagnostic manual of psychiatry defines fear as an emotional response of a real or perceived imminent threat. But anxiety, it defines as an emotional response to a real or perceived future threat. I guess I'd like to craft a definition, but maybe it'll grow as I grow with you and learn with you in this sermon series. But today, I would say peace is, from a biblical perspective, inward serenity, well-being, and calm, untarnished by the ups and downs of life. Or just to say, an untroubled heart in a troubled world. Heart is a word we're going to be looking at a lot, and it's at the center of Jesus' promise here. Proverbs 4 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And Paul said to the Colossians, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body, you're called to peace. The heart. It's like it's being described as some deep inward command center. Years ago, Gordon MacDonald wrote a best-selling book called Ordering Your Private World. And in one of the early chapters, he tells a story of a friend of his who was an officer on a U.S. Navy nuclear submarine. And one day at sea, there were a lot of ships that were passing by overhead, causing great turbulence, and the officer who was in command had to make a lot of violent maneuvers with the submarine to avoid collision. And as the submarine was being shaken around by these maneuvers, the captain, who'd been in his quarters, comes running to the command center, the bridge, and there he comes up to this officer and says, is everything okay? And the duty officer says, yes, sir. Everything's fine, sir. And the captain looks around and says, you're right, everything seems to be okay. And he went back to his quarters. I like the way MacDonald writes about that. He says, all around that submarine, the potential danger of collision was lurking. It was enough to make any alert captain show concern. But that danger was outside. Down deep inside the sub was a quiet place where there could be absolute control of the ship's destiny. And that was where the captain instinctively headed. On the bridge, the center of command, there was not a hint of panic, only a calm and deliberate series of actions being carried out by a highly trained crew of seamen doing their jobs. Thus, when the commander appeared on the bridge to assure himself that everything was in order, it was. I think it's a good picture of the heart, that is like a deep command center. And when life is jarring, that there's a way that we could learn to look into our heart and go, is everything okay? And if the heart is okay, then no matter how troubled the sea is around us, everything's okay. Maybe we'll talk about this some more in the future, but there seems to be a distinction in the Bible between the heart and spirit and soul. Spirit, pneuma, soul, psyche, have a distinction in that the spirit is that living, vital, reborn self that is eternal within every Christian and communes directly with God. And the soul is the psyche, like the mind and the way we think and the emotions that we feel. The heart, some people say, is used interchangeably with spirit and soul, but I think it's different. I was reading this week a classic book, Word Studies in the New Testament, M.R. Vincent, who suggested something that one of our ministry leaders suggested to me many years ago, maybe is right, is that the heart is like a mediating link between spirit and soul. This is just conjecture, but that's what Vincent says, that it seems to be talked of that way. The heart is this deep, inmost being, part of our being, that somehow is helping us, who we are as a spiritual being, to relay that to our minds so that it comes into alignment with who we really are in Christ. The heart needs to be untroubled. The word for troubled is a word in Greek that means to stir it all about, shake it all up vigorously. That's troubled. We know what that feels like when our hearts feel like that. It's got a little bit the way I felt driving away from the golf course the other day. It's like, I just feel a little troubled. Why? What is that? See? And the word for afraid that Jesus uses has really the connotation of just cowardice, like that kind of thing that makes you shrink back and not move forward. And Jesus makes this promise that's so beautiful. And I want you to want this and yearn for this, because part of it is the invitation to receive from Jesus. He says, peace I leave. It's like, I could take it with me, but I'm going to not just take it and keep it unto myself. I leave this. It's speaking like I bequeath it to you, and proving that it is a gift and it is now actively being given. And he says, my peace I give to you. This isn't a religion, a philosophy, an ideology, a technique, or a practice. He's saying, I'm giving to you my own peace. Wow. The disciples were going to be so troubled when Jesus was crucified and departed from this earth, and he knew that. And what he's saying is, I'm not leaving with you a system of thought. I'm leaving you with my own peace. He's saying there is something transferable about his peace. Some years ago, I was getting ready to leave the house and come and preach for video capture. And as I was leaving, I could not believe it, but something was darting around the room in our bedroom. And I looked, and a small bird somehow had found its way into our house and into our bedroom and was flying frantically around the way a bird would do. Our windows are all covered with screens. I couldn't open them up. And I've got to go preach, and I got a bird flying around, a little bird flying around crazy in my bedroom. And I'm like, oh no, I can't just close up the bedroom and leave it in here. And my wife finds out that there was a bird doing who knows what in our bedroom flying around while I was gone. I've got to do something about this. So I start waving my hands, trying to get the bird to move towards the door. But that bird's got to move out the bedroom door, down a hallway, and then out the front door. And I'm trying. Of course, the more I move my hands around, the more the bird's frantic. I move my hands this way, bird flies that way. I move my hands this way, bird flies that way. Bird hides under the bed. I had to crawl up under there, shoo him out from under the bed. The bird is going crazy. The bird is so troubled. And I am troubled. And I then decide I'll take a big towel and try to throw it on the bird and capture him. But you can't do that. It doesn't work. Throw the towel, bird's gone. I finally had to call my wife and said, honey, I might have to leave a bird in the house. She was somewhere else. She said, well, have we got a net? I said, no. She said, I'll go try to buy a net, maybe a net. And I said, I got one idea, terrible idea. I said, but we're getting desperate here. I said, I could get the tennis racket. Just stun him a little bit. Just give him one little backhand. She said, you will do no such thing, that little bird. And I said, okay, you're right. And so I just hung up with her and I said, God, what are we going to do? And then I remembered, I believe in the power of blessing. And I never saw a rule that said it couldn't apply to an animal. So I said, I've tried everything else. I'm going to try it. And I just let everything calm down. And y'all, you can't make this stuff up. I'm telling you, I would never fib to you. This is exactly what happened. I calmed way down and I started talking to that little bird. And he calmed down and he stood in the middle of the floor. And I was motionless. And I said, little bird, I don't know you, you don't know me, but we need to get to know each other a little bit here. I said, I intend you no harm. I apologize for that tennis racket comment. I said, I just would like to help you out of this house. You don't want to be in this house, and I don't want you to be in this house. You're anxious about it, and I'm anxious about it. So let's just calm down here. And bird, little bird, I believe you can walk your way right out of this house. And I started blessing that little bird, and I became the bird whisperer. And y'all, I'm not making this up. That little bird took about 2 hops towards the door. And I said, that's the way you do it, little bird. And I took one little gentle step behind him, and he took 2 more hops and 2 more hops. And I gently, slowly came behind him, talking to him real calmly. Little bird, you keep on hopping. He hopped out the bedroom door and got into the hallway, and I stepped gently behind him to let him know go that way. He took 3 more hops until he got down and he saw the glass of the front door, and he stared out the glass. And I gently went over and I opened it real slowly, and the little bird hopped out, and he was happy and I was happy. And I don't know why that happened, except maybe for me to tell you this story, that peace in some weird way is transferable. And Jesus is talking about something supernatural here. But he is saying, I don't want you just to have a measure of peace. He's offering his own peace. And he says this is not as the world gives. It's not the world gives in the sense, as we've already noted, that it's not superficial. But it's also his own peace so that it's not merely a strategy. I think that we'll make mention throughout this series of some of the ways that the world has discovered that we can help manage anxiety. You hear me say this often, all truth is God's truth. If in secular society something is discovered that is true and helpful, then great, it's part of God's truth. And you don't necessarily need to know God in order to have a piece of his truth. And so I affirm things that will help, like mindfulness, learning to live in a moment, meditation in the good sense of the word, where you learn to focus on something that's outside of the rush of anxious thoughts in your mind, focused breathing, exercise, being outdoors, behavioral, cognitive therapies that are done well, medications, all of this I affirm, and we will affirm. But Jesus is offering something different than that. I think that's part of what the world has to give. He said, I don't give you to you like that. He said, I'm making more of a direct transfer, a share of my own spirit of calm. When the world is offering peace, it is usually related to correcting the circumstances. It's a peace that says, okay, everything's better now. But that's not what Jesus is offering. He's offering something better than that. It's like when I made the decision to just pick up those golf balls and just head to my car and drive off, it was the best decision, right? We don't need a newspaper article about, pastor gets into a fight with man on golf course or something. I don't need to step in any of those traps. But I wanted to hit a few more chip shots, and I didn't. And I drive away, and I feel a little angsty, but everything's okay because what did I do? I put an end to the conflict that was happening. And a lot of times that's really wise to do that, right? In as much as possible, be at peace with all people. It's way better than arousing more conflict. But it's still peace as the world gives. So, and put it more starkly, if I wanted that man to quit yelling at me in the dark on the golf course, I just best move along. And now we've got some measure of peace, but it's peace as the world gives. Jesus is offering something that is so much better, so much more beautiful and wonderful than that. He's offering for you to, in some way, see as He sees, and therefore think as He thinks, and to therefore experience what He experiences. Jesus has perfect peace with the Father. There's perfect love shared in the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So there's no sense of angst between the Son and the Father. The Father has said, "This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased." And the Son revels in His submission to the Father. And Jesus is saying, I want you to have that. What happens in life is that our sin creates brokenness and causes offense. And when it does, there's a big gulf. We know that. Anytime that you sin against someone, there's a big distance between you unless there's forgiveness. But this happened on a cosmic scale between humanity and God. And maybe if you're just exploring Christianity, or maybe you've been in church a lot, but you're really intrigued by what is the gospel, what does it really mean, and why does that word mean good news? Here it is. God knew that we could not correct that distance and that we would be forever anxious because of that distance. The same way we're anxious in a relationship if there's not forgiveness and healing and reconciliation. But we can never live a righteous life, so we can never think, I'm good enough for God to really be pleased with me. So God came to solve the problem. He became human flesh in the person of Jesus and lived a perfectly righteous life and lived in a perfect peace with no anxiety in His heart. He had authentic calm in His inmost being at the command center of His heart, which is God's design for all of humanity. And Jesus said, I want to give that to you. And the way He's going to give it is by bearing our sin on the cross so that we would know our sin is not held against us anymore, so that we could have the same peace with the Father that the Son Himself does. The gift of the gospel is so wonderful that when we really know it and embrace it, that we live with a sense of absolute certainty that there's no more distance between us and the Father. And we experience, therefore, what Jesus experiences. And this is what Jesus offers, and He offers us nothing less than this, to have His own peace. Wow! I want that, don't you? And I don't just want it from time to time. I want that all the time. Peace I leave you. My peace I give you. Not as the world gives. Don't let your hearts be troubled, nor let them be afraid. This is deep and rich and miraculous and beautiful and available to every single believer. My peace I give to you. I was reading some this week about the story about an English missionary named Alan Gardner. In 1851, after having had a military career and then becoming an evangelist because of his great zeal to reach people with the love of God, he was on his way to South America, and he got onto a remote island as he was an area called Banner Cove, at Tierra del Fuego, the waters of Tierra del Fuego. He and his traveling companions set up and they built a thorny fence around their supplies and put a tent, but the natives began stealing from them, the people they wanted to reach with the love of God. And eventually all their supplies were stolen, and the ship that had gotten them was not going to come back for 4 months. And month after month went by. They had very little contact with the Fuegians, and they ran out of provisions, and one by one the men died of starvation. But what's so telling is that Gardner's journal was left right next to him where he died. And he had written in one of his final entries, he had written from his bunk in his tent. He said, "I'm happy day and night, hour by hour, asleep or awake. I'm happy beyond words." And he says, I unknown to the world, I live here day and night, and my affections and my thoughts are happy. And he says, let all my beloved ones at home rest assured I was happy beyond expectations. And he said, and I would not have changed situations with any man living. And the last journal entry that he made was from Psalm 34:10 on the day he died. Psalm 34:10 says, this is what it says. It says, the young lions do lack and suffer hunger, but they that seek the Lord shall not want any good thing. And he wrote his last words, I'm overwhelmed with a sense of the goodness of God. I think that's what, in its depths, an untroubled heart looks like. That regardless of the ups and downs of life, there's a way that Jesus can share with you his own peace, the calm of his very heart, that you can live with a pervasive awareness of the goodness of God and share in the Savior's own peace. That's what he's offered. It's available. And that's the gospel.